Good evening, travelers. Humor me with a question. If a grave spoke, would you lean closer or cross yourself and walk on? Stay a moment. You're listening to Somnolent Conspiracies, where we greet you properly, ask you to think with us, and keep the light steady while a darker story breathes. Tonight we go to Venice, to the cemetery island where the cypresses stand like green candles and the brackish air salts everything it can touch. In recent weeks, visitors swear that certain headstones have been changing overnight. Not crumbling, not weathering, changing. Names thinning into anagrams that point like fingers, dates sliding by a single day, epitaphs gaining an extra line no mason cut. Each time, within a day, someone connected to a long quiet death drowns in a canal, chokes in a gondola's wake, or is found in a chapel with a blue stain on the sleeve. People blame the tide. Others whisper that the dead have found a better pen. Our investigator will keep respect for the bones and suspicion for the living. She will read the stone like a ledger. Salt bloom, lime wash, condensation trails. She will test whether sunlight can ghost a letter into life, whether a caretaker's brush can write with brine, and whether a grieving woman learned to turn a name into a verdict. She will also listen, because now and then the city still makes the hair rise without asking permission. Ready? Button your coat. If a letter shifts while we're looking, mark the time. In Venice, water is always writing. The trick is learning whose hand it is. Part 1, the letters moved. The Vaporetto left me at Fondamenti Nova little after midnight, the lagoon lying flat and metallic as a blade. From there, the night boat crossed to San Michele, Cypress Island, the wall of the dead, its low engine purring like a cat that had learned patience. The cemetery rose out of the water in a pale rectangle, all brick and shadow. When the prow knocked the stone steps, I climbed alone with a torch and my badge and felt the salt on my lips before I tasted it. Venice always salts you first. Johnny Morrow waited just inside the gate with his cap in his hands. He was a man built of habits. Clean boots, keys in order, the face of someone who has learned to speak softly among the graves. He passed me the sign-in ledger. Vespers had ended at 1900. The night patrol had checked at 21. After that, nothing. No footprints in the dust of the service corridor. No scuff on the gate bar. No candles burned down to change the shadows. And yet, he said, the letters had moved. Show me, I told him. We walked the main path, a pale aisle between rows of stone, the cypresses lifting their dark columns. The air was brackish and exact. Somewhere a small animal rustled and then remembered to be still. I kept my light low. Johnny led me to a section near the wall, where the tombs grew closer together, stone shoulders pressed in a conversation nobody overheard. He stopped at the first headstone and stepped back as if from a mirror that had begun answering questions he hadn't asked. The slab was white marble veined with a little blue, the sort of stone that takes rain like a message. The name read, Alvise Saranzo, beloved husband, father, brother. But the first A had gone pale across its crossbar. In the bevel, the groove had whitened to a stiff little lambda, as if the letter had shed its arm and stood to attention. The O in Saranzo had taken on a hard, narrow oval, more a zero than a mouth. The epitaph line, which should have ended in peace, carried a faint extra stroke at the end, one that could be the beginning of a different letter entirely. Yesterday, Johnny whispered, they were right. The stonecutter made them right. This morning, like this. I crouched and brought the beam close. There were no tool marks, no scratches, no recent chisel bruises in the groove. But in each letter's hollow a delicate bloom had formed salt crystal and lime, the kind of mat that drinks light instead of throwing it. When I touched the edge, the pad of my glove came away dry, as if the stone had exhaled dust instead of moisture. I smelled a suggestion of something sweet, almost nothing, the way sugar smells when you grind it. This is one, Johnny said. There are two more. The second stone belonged to Sister Caterina, a sacristan who had lived most of her life in a convent on the Giudecca. Her E had grown a short lower arm, like a clumsy F, and the O in Caterina carried a whisper of a notch that did not belong to it. The third was for Vittoria Malin, a gallery owner with a list of patrons thick as a hymnal. On hers, An R at the end of a line had started to ghost itself in the white. A skeletal leg and a curl, half born from nothing. Each of these stones, Johnny swore and I believed him, had looked proper at vespers. Each showed a new pallor by dawn. The dead had their own speed. The living, too. Within a day of each change, a living person, tied somehow to a boy named Marco Dandolo who drowned last spring, had died. Alvise Saranzo, a boatman who knew every wake and shortcut, had been found face down behind a mooring pile in Canariggio, his wrists chafed by rope. Sister Caterina had collapsed in a chapel on Murano with a blue stain on her sleeve, the color a restorer might know. And Vittoria Malin had choked in a private gondola's swell not far from the salute, the gondolier cursing the wake but unable to explain the bruise at her throat. People blame the tide, Johnny said, almost to himself, or the devil. They bring flowers and light candles and say nothing. Who has the keys? I asked. Besides you. Father Paolo for the side gate, I for the main. The night patrol carries a check fob, not a key. If the side gate opens, the bell in the custodian's office rings. It did not ring. I signed the ledger. My name, Detective Lucia Ferraro, Carabinieri. The date, the time. Then I asked him to walk me the perimeter. We traced the wall, stone to water, checking the weak places, the little iron doors that open to maintenance corridors, the hinged plates that cover power conduits. Nothing so much as breathed. In the service room, I examined the gate counter, an old piece of brass with a ratchet too honest to lie. It had not been tripped. My torch found a fingernail of blue cloth caught on a nail head near the side gate hinges. Old, frayed, not fresh, but the dust clinging to it was ordinary wall lime, the same as anywhere in a place that sheds its own bones to stay upright. No footprints, but then, San Michel's paths are mostly stone and pebble. The lagoon is a great laundress. It scrubs and resets. Candles? I asked. Unburned, he said. I checked. We returned to the stones. The marble held the night like breath held too long. I stood at Alvise's grave and listened. An investigator's listening is a different thing than superstitions. You ask the air for temperature and the stone for its thirst. I leaned in until I could feel the cool radiating from that lambda, that misbehaving air. Up close, the groove showed a thinness that didn't belong to a chisel. It looked as if a clear wash had been laid into the letter, lime or glue or salt paste, then dried to invisibility. In the damp hours before sunrise, it had pulled moisture from the air, and the matte change had registered as a new letter to any eye hungry for meaning. Johnny, I said, do you have plain tape? The kind you use to label drawers. He fetched it. I tore it into little witness strips and pressed each piece flat against the marble beside certain strokes. The A's crossbar, the O's lower curve, the half-born R. The tape would not prevent anything. It would show it. If moisture began to run, if condensation tracked down a particular path, the paper would wrinkle or show a darkened edge. I marked the locations in my notebook with a sketch and the time. What are you thinking? He asked. That the island writes, but only with a hand. Salt moves where someone tells it to sit. I want to see when it sits down. I unpacked a small motion-triggered camera and a thermal clip-on lens and mounted them on a cypress stake with gaffer tape, the way we do when a place needs eyes. I set the angle low so the camera would catch the plane of the stone in a grazing rake. A high angle sees names. A low angle sees texture. I checked the battery. I set the clock, synced to my watch. I gave the lens a narrow field so that every exhalation of vapor, every spider thread of condensation at the letter bottoms, would stand up like a confession. On the second stone, for Sister Caterina, I repeated the ritual. Strips, sketch, angle. On the third, for Vittoria, the same. The camera's LED blinked once to tell me it was awake and would wake again at motion. A gull watched from the wall and thought its slow gull thoughts. The air from the lagoon lifted and fell, lifted and fell. You think this is a trick? Johnny asked. His voice did not argue. It feared a little. I think someone knows the hour when the air answers stone, and how to ask it a question it will answer the same way each time, I said. I think the letters moved because the wet had been told to sit in the shape of accusation. And I think the person who knows that hour didn't climb over your wall. They had a key, or a conscience that rang no bell. We walked back to the gatehouse. I locked the section behind us with a chain through the iron stanchions, then added one of my own seals. A paper strip across the chain link stamped with my case number and signed. The island would keep its silence. If someone broke the seal, the paper would tear, and the tear would tell me a story when I came back to read it. At the desk, I wrote a notice for Father Paolo and left it under the bell clapper. The Carabinieri had placed a temporary lock on Section D, access by my authority only. I did not ring the bell. Let the hour keep its secrets for one more night. Go home, I told Johnny. Sleep in the office if you must, but do not make rounds. If you hear anything, you call me. Do not be brave. I want the stones to speak to the camera, not to you. He nodded and crossed himself, then thought better of it and nodded again without the sign. I walked back to the Vaporetto stop and waited with the island behind me, the cypress tops cutting at the stars. The city across the water was a set of weak jewelry lights strung along a wrist bone. Somewhere, a bell counted 1 in the morning in a thin voice. 3, I would return. Dawn is a slow knife in Venice. If a letter intended to shift while we looked, we would mark the time and the temperature and the way the wet carried itself like ink that had not yet admitted it was ink. Until then, we watched, instruments open, eyes narrow, breath held. Because on San Michele, the dead were tidy, but the living still had things to write. Part 2, What Stone and Salt Can Do. I was back on San Michele before sunrise, the water taking a breath and holding it. The camera had burned a steady red through the small hours, and the paper seals on the chain were unbroken. I unlocked the section with the clean click of a key that had learned to keep its promises, then crossed the gravel path with the deliberate gait you use when every little pebble tells on you. The marble had changed. Not much, never much, but enough that the human eye, hungry for pattern, could not pretend otherwise. On Alvise Soranzo's slab, the first A was now a thin, stiff lambda, the horizontal stroke bleached away into something like the suggestion of snow. The O in Soranzo had tightened to a 0, a careful oval that swallowed light. On Sister Caterina's stone, the E had paled along its lowest arm so that, at a glance, it wanted to be an F. On Vittoria's, the faint stem and curl of an R had come closer to the surface, like a fish testing air. I bent to the paper witness strips I had placed the night before. Each little rectangle had a corner lifted. Along the strip by the A's crossbar, a dark, delicate tide line had crept in from the top left edge and stopped halfway across, as if something had drunk exactly that much and no more. On the O's strip, a faint wetting at the lower right, the place where a 0 would be narrowest, had wrinkled the paper in a tiny fan. On the R strip, a single diagonal darkening from upper left to lower right, a stroke written by an invisible hand. I took photographs and noted the times, then checked the camera. I cupped the screen and played back the night in fast time. At 3:11 a.m. thin bell tone, no source in frame, ringed the silence like a circle drawn tight. Between 3:12 and 3:18, the thermal clip registered a subtle fall at the marble surface, a coolness like a breath held against skin. Moisture condensed in a slant. Not a general damp, but a guided one, drawing itself along certain grooves and edges, settling in the places where a letter could change with the slightest shift of matte and sheen. No human stepped into the frame. No moth, no spider. Just air that had been given a path. Condensation is a democracy in most places. It votes for every surface equally. Here it obeyed a party line. I took scrapings with a sterile blade from within the letter grooves and from untouched stone nearby, kept them separate in labeled vials, and left the slabs otherwise undisturbed. When I touched the inner edge of the A with the back of a gloved knuckle, it felt faintly rough, powder dry, lime bloom rather than wet. The sweetness in the air was a ghost, now here, now gone, and when I stepped back into the shade, I could not smell it at all. The sun hoisted itself to a low angle and painted everything honest. I left the island long enough to cross to the lab at Santa Marta, where the technicians with their steady hands and ex-smoker patients know the difference between nothing and almost nothing. While they spun the samples and peered at them, I sat at a side bench with my notebook and began writing a list of what stone will do for you if asked correctly. 1. Marble is a sponge with expensive habits. Its pores communicate, Capillary action will pull water along crystalline paths and leave it at edges if you show it where to go. 2. Lime wash. A thin slurry of calcium hydroxide dries almost invisible. If a film is laid into a letter groove, it can change the surface's appetite for water. The same air that leaves one part untouched will dampen another to a soft mat. 3. Salt, especially sea salt, and sugar are hygroscopic. They draw water out of air that would rather mind its own business. Mixed in the right ratio, the paste waits until the humidity crosses a threshold, then drinks. That drink shows as pallor and dullness. 4. At dawn in Venice, the air often crosses thresholds. The technician, a woman named Esposito who wears nail polish the color of bruised plums, came to me with a thin smile. "Your stone has a sweet tooth," she said, and slid a printout across the bench. Under polarized light, the scrapings from inside the grooves showed crystals not native to the marble. Cubic halite, sea salt, and amorphous sucrose, both in minute quantity. No binder that fluoresced strongly, which suggested the film, if any, was lime rather than an organic gum. Trace volatile residues resembled citrus blossom, narrowly or something in that family, but at low parts per million. "Someone paints invisible lines," I said, "with a patience I would not expect from the living," Esposito said, "and a precision a conservator might envy." "Could the same happen without a hand?" I asked. "Could salt carried by the air collect that obediently on its own?" "In a general way, yes," she said. "The stones weep. You know this? On certain tides, the salts move. But to make an A throw away its crossbar and stand like that." She tapped the photo of the lambda with a painted nail. "That is not weeping. That is discipline." I carried the data back to San Michel and stood again with the dead. The island had its own acoustics. Every little sound had bones in it. I checked the camera angles, reset the motion threshold slightly lower, and moved along the row to find a control. An untouched stone with similar marble, similar exposure, no signs of deliberate mischief. I found one. An old slab with a simple name and a date and no poetry. I cleaned a small patch with distilled water, then dry cotton, then laid a thin wash of lime over a single letter and let it dry. On another letter, I laid a smear of my own salt-sugar mix at a different dilution, tucked in with a hairbrush. On a third, I did nothing. I placed fresh paper strips at identical points and made a note. Control, lime. Control, salt/sugar. Control, none. The cemetery held its breath and watched me pretend to be a mason of ghosts. A caretaker's ledger in the gatehouse, brown paper, penmanship with a sway to it, held an entry from a decade back. Asterisk on certain mornings the letters appear brighter at the edges. Humidity very high, no vandalism observed. Visitors remark on it. We call it the stone's weeping. Father says it is piety. I say it is physics. Asterisk I copied the page number and left the book as I found it. Midday in Venice makes liars out of the morning's mysteries. I walked the paths, crabwise to the light, and tried to find any honest tool mark I had missed. There were none. The groove's high strokes, the places where a rubbing sheet would burnish if pressed too hard, showed the faintest shine on Alvi's slab, as though someone had registered the letters by taking rubbings with dry paper and a soft tool. That would account for the way the paste sat only in the depths and not on the face. It would also account for the faint friction haze at the crown of the S and the shoulder of the R. Back at the control stone, I misted the air from a spray bottle held low, imitating the shallow angle of dawn wet. The letter with the lime only wash took the damp and paled slightly at the edge. The letter with the salt-sugar mixed deepened to a flat mat and held it stubbornly. The untreated letter beaded and then dried to its usual gloss. Only one of the three looked like the work on Alvi's stone. And only one was obscene in its obedience to a command no one would admit giving. By late afternoon, the lagoon had begun its slow pull. I crossed to the city for a quick consult with a conservator at the academia who owed me a favor and an explanation. In his view, a thin lime wash is often laid to tone a repair. If someone knew that and had a grudge in time, they could lay washes invisibly in letter hollows. If they cut the wash with a sugar solution and dusted with salt, the capillary pattern would ring the letter where the groove invited it. The result would not be ink, but it would read like ink when the air came right. You would need to know more than chemistry, he said. You would need to know the island's breath, the hour it draws water and the hour it gives it back. An artisan who works with stone and bronze? I asked. He shrugged. A restorer, a sacristan used to cleaning altars, a boatman who knows when the fog comes down and every bell is a wall. Venice raises many precise people. Evening settled on San Michel like a shawl that had known what shoulders to fit since the Republic still had teeth. I returned to the section with the controls. The lime-only letter showed a small shift at its edge. The salt-sugar letter had darkened its paper witness to an angular bloom. The untreated letter was the same as always. I took this personally. I walked the 3 targeted graves again, however slowly, and paid attention to the strangest little things. The way the ants chose one side of the path, the way the cypress sap bled clear, the way a pale moth beat itself twice against the stone and then decided against it. I listened for the bell that had chimed at 3:11 on the video. Bells are clocks in Venice, but they are also conspirators. Each church keeps its own milliseconds. I found Father Paolo in the chapel before Vespers, polishing a thurible and speaking to it as if it were a shy cat. He was a lean man with eyes too bright for the room's light. I asked him nothing about keys yet. I asked him about bells. He told me that the small oratory on the other side of the wall sometimes rang late for matins. He smiled when he said it, as if the island enjoyed running 5 minutes wrong. Back in the section, I marked the stone faces with chalk arrows, discreet, for me, not for anyone else, showing the direction of the morning's wedding. Top left to bottom right, the same on all 3. Prevailing breeze at that hour had been from the northeast. The tide had been rising. The thermal data showed the surface cooling more quickly than the air by a fraction that matters only if you are a letter. Somewhere in the city, a gondola thumped its moorings in a way I did not enjoy thinking about. A gull laughed because that is what gulls do when they forget themselves. I set the camera again, lowered the motion threshold again, replaced the paper strips with fresh, and penned in my notebook a simple sentence that looked calm on the page and felt like a small, cold truth in the hand. Asterisk conclusion. Someone is painting invisible guides that reveal at a predictable dawn humidity. The letters are persuaded, not possessed. Asterisk. Night would test the rest. But the question that remained, the one that never leaves a room just because you turn off the light, was simple and sharp enough to carry in a pocket. If it's a trick, who knows the chemistry and has night access? Part 3, The Living Tide to the Dead. Venice is a ledger with water for ink. You learn to read its crossings, who owes whom, who drowned when, who pretends not to remember. By late afternoon, I had the 3 most recent entries in front of me like a balance sheet that refused to stay closed. Alvise Saranzo, boatman. Not a gondolier, a working man with a low skiff and a calendar of delivery routes in his head. People said he could read a wake the way a midwife reads a pulse. He'd been the one on duty the night Marco Dandolo fell, close enough to be first with a boat hook, far enough to arrive after the screaming. He testified that the boy slipped on algae at the fondamenta, struck his head, slid in. He said he'd tried. The bruise patterns on Marco's scalp had agreed with a fall. The water had done the rest. Sister Caterina, sacristan, a woman who moved in places that smell like beeswax and stone. She kept keys, linens, and schedules. The convent on the Giudecca trusted her to open doors and to close them again. She had been in the vicinity that night too. She admitted nothing more than hearing a disturbance, offering prayers, and telling the police what she could. She died months later, clean as an empty glass, collapsing during a quiet hour in a side chapel with the faintest ring of blue wax on her sleeve no one could explain. Vittoria Malin, gallery owner. A professional of openings, closings, champagne. Her patron list read like a gossip column that had learned Latin. She funded restorations because it looked good in a gala program. She'd been hosting something the week Marco died. A young restorer drowning in the same neighborhood as your donors is never good for the after-dinner speech. No one accused her of anything more than annoyance. The epitaph on her family stone had not moved while she was alive. It had moved after. 3 lives, 3 letters. 3 small edits on stone that pointed forensic fingers. Each had touched the night Marco died. None had worn a charge. and now each was dead. The case file on Marco still smelled new when I opened it in the office on Santa Croce. He was 23, apprenticed to a respected restorer named Tommaso Vivarini, the kind of mentor who speaks with his hands and whose temper has the shape of a chisel, blunt until it isn't. The boy had grown up in Castello, knew the water, rowed well enough to be useless only to the stupid. He had been kind, his mother wrote, in a letter folded beneath the petition for a new inquiry. He had also been stubborn, a trait that Venice punishes in those who don't inherit palazzi. I signed out a copy of the accident report and walked to San Zaccaria by way of streets Marco would have known. Alleys that silenced you by simple geometry. The perfumery where his mother worked was waist-wide, stacked with glass and domestic avalanches waiting to happen. A bell on the door hummed like a fly and then allowed itself to be elegant. The shop smelled of choices. Bergamot, neroli, benzoin. A faint medicinal cleanness from alcohol that was not pretending to be anything else. Bottles rose in ranks like a parade that had survived a war and decided to go on with it. Buona sera, said the woman at the counter. She had the kind of face that never fully returns from looking at water. The name pin, if you could call a ribbon with hand-stitched thread a pin, read Rosa in script. Detective Lucia Ferraro, I said, and set my badge on the counter where it could learn to behave among glass. May I ask you about your son? She nodded without touching the badge. You may ask everything, she said. I will answer nothing I have already answered, unless you mean to write it down properly this time. I mean to, I said. We spoke in the language people use when grief has begun to harden into knowledge. She told me what the petition already said. Marco had been sober. He had met with his mentor earlier that evening at a small workshop by the Arsenal. He had left just after 10. He had cut across toward Castello to see a girl whose name Rosa did not offer because it would not help me and would not help the girl. Somewhere near a certain fondamenta, she would not say which because the city does not like its ugly corners named. He fell. What did Alvise do? I asked. He overcharged, she said, and he rode drunk. The night my son died, he had drunk because he always did after 7. He told me later, in confession, that he had arrived with his boat hook too late, and his hands were shaking. She stared at the glass shelf behind me without seeing it. He did not intend to kill anyone. He also did not intend to be a sober man who could pull a boy fast. And Sister Caterina? Rosa's mouth tightened. She kept a key to a boat that belonged to the church, kept under a tarpaulin on a pier that should have been locked. A boat that allowed someone to push off very quickly from a mooring and arrive somewhere they should not have been, without needing to find their own. She kept a key, and she kept her peace. And Vittoria? Rosa's eyes dropped to my hands. She paid for an opening the next night. She paid for silence everywhere. She did not pay me. There are envelopes in the world that leave fingerprints made of perfume and money and boredom. She knew Alvise rode for some of her people. She knew he was drunk more often than not because she was the sort of woman who knows when a man is moving in a way that stains her appointment book. Did you threaten them? I asked because the question belonged in the air, not only in my notes. I left warnings on stone, she said, as if reciting a creed. I wanted the city to read. I made the letters say that guilt had a name, not because I knew that name would drown, but because the stones are stubborn and the living are more so. I did not put rope on a wrist. I did not press a woman's throat against a swell. I did not ring a bell to make a man fall down. The bell in the shop door made a polite noise to tell us someone had approached and seen 2 women speaking in the voice carnivals do not use. The figure outside decided not to enter. The glass side. Who bought narrowly from you in the last month? I asked. The heavier grade. The one that warms slower. She held my gaze and then reached for a ledger with a practical hand. Everyone who buys it signs, she said. Some write their names as if it were a kind of performance. Some press hard enough to leave a 3rd copy without carbon. I sell to people who want to smell like orange blossom without going outside. She smiled without showing any teeth. You will find a priest, a restorer, and a tourist here. The tourist is innocent because tourists are guilty only of tourism. The restorer and the priest are guilty of being Venetian. copied the names. Tommaso Vivarini was among them. So was Father Paolo. Johnny's name did not appear. Caretakers smell like work, which is different. When I stepped back into the city's air, it tasted flatter without the shop's perfumed illusions. The water at the Riva had begun its evening argument with the stones. I crossed toward the cemetery as the light went tired. Johnny met me at the gate with his cap in his hands again. He looked as if he had seen a dog make the sign of the cross. "What is it?" I asked. He led me at speed along the path, his boots dignified and brisk at once. At the family plot for a minor glassmaker whose name tourists pretend to know, he stopped and pointed. The headstone had never been remarkable and was no more so now, except that, in the lower right of the epitaph, where a line about eternal light had always ended clean, a faint haze had gathered. Not a letter yet, just the shape a letter makes when it is still deciding what letter to be. I bent close. The haze wasn't general. It had the outline of a capital R's leg, the diagonal without the bowl. The paper strip I lifted to the place took a shallow breath of wet and sliced it into evidence. I wrote the time, 1842. Night air should not have been doing that, not like dawn. Not with the wind wrong and the tide turned. But the island has its own weather when someone is asking it a favor. "Who is buried here?" I asked. Johnny gave me the name. It matched nothing in my file. The living, however, those attached to this plot, rang a small bell in my head I did not like. The glassmaker's granddaughter had married into a family that funded shows with Vittoria. The same family had employed alvise to carry men and cases back and forth to places where money goes to separate itself from wherever it came from. The R, if it decided to be an R, could begin a dozen names. But only one, in this circle, had been printed on a petition for a new inquiry, copied and folded and prayed over. "Rosa," I said under my breath. "You think?" "I think someone who has been moving letters like symmetry," I said. "I think someone wants the city to see that the stones are impartial. And I think the fourth person to die would make that letter complete." We stood very still beneath the cypress branches that remember more wind than they admit. I called my station and asked for a quiet patrol to sit on Rosa Street. 2 officers in a car that looked like sleep, and another 2 on feet that knew how to avoid making conversations end. I asked that they text me every hour without playing with their siren, and that they remember the water can be louder than a man who means to use it. Then I asked for a tale on anyone with a key or key-like habits. Father Paolo, who had reason to ring a bell. Tommaso Vivarini, who had reason to ring a man. Johnny, though I disliked the thought because anyone with a gate in his pocket gets a place on a list he didn't ask for. I added 2 custodians from elsewhere who had borrowed access for repairs within the last month. Venice hands keys around like gossip. I wanted to know who caught what. I rechecked the chain, the seals, the camera angles, the paper strips. I chalked a second, smaller arrow beside the newborn R-leg to remind my later self that it had begun as diagonal and not as curve. I told Johnny to go nowhere near the side gate unless he wanted me to hate him for an hour. He accepted this as if I'd asked him not to stand in rain. On the ride back across the water to arrange details no one will ever write poems about, I watched the city lift its lamps and thought about the pressure of symmetry on a mind already bent by grief and certainty. A stone letter is not a summons. It is an image of one. But a man who thinks the island agrees with him will decide he is allowed to become its arm. Prevent a 4th death. Lock the section and leave eyes in it. Put a hand on Rosa Dandelo's day and night and do not take it off until the island proves it can spell mercy. Tail those who walk with keys after midnight. Listen for bells that are not clocks. And remember, Salt writes boldly, but only where a hand tells it where to sit. Part 4, The Night Watch. We set the watch at 1 in the morning, the hour when the city's skull shows through its makeup. Marta met me at Fondamenti Nove with a thermos and the calm she carries like a map. She is all wrists and patience and the kind of eyes that don't miss when the dark decides to speak. We crossed to San Michele in a higher skiff whose engine had learned to whisper. The lagoon was a pane of black glass scored by a few patient wakes. Wind calm. Tide rising. The kind of gradual, muscular rise that lifts a city a finger's width and tells no one until the hour after. We unlocked the chain and slid inside the section with a gentleness born of superstition and forensics. The cameras were already mounted from the nights before, their red eyelids shut and knowing when to open. I had added a thermal monocular to our kit, a little black coffin that sees temperatures the way Saint C whispers. We staked out positions. Marta took the shadow of a cypress just off Sister Katerina's gravestone, low to the ground with the thermal lens pointed along the marble plane. I settled across from Alvai's slab, high enough to watch the path to the side gate, low enough to be another part of the island's patience. We spoke little and then not at all. The dead listen better if you remember you are a guest. At 2:13, a stray cat threaded the path and pretended we were not there. At 2:47, the tide lapped audibly against the wall 3 slow breaths. Then a pause long enough to make you forget breath is a habit. Marta checked the thermal, gave me a tiny circle with her fingers. Normal gradients, nothing but the cold of stone warming by fractions no one but the machine could love. I checked my watch and entered the air data. 19 degrees Celsius, humidity climbing, wind negligible. The cypress bough above me gave a small, dry shudder, like a dream it didn't enjoy. The 3:11, the bell. Not loud, not official. A faint tone, as if a small brass mouth had spoken from under a blanket somewhere beyond the wall. The sound drew a circle around us and then tightened it. My heart stepped into the circle because that is what hearts do. Marta's head lifted a degree and then went still again. The thermal lens in her hand hummed a little at the edge of hearing, the way electronics do when they stand up straighter. At the path by the side gate, the shadow changed shape. The gate itself stayed closed, its bar steady, the chain sleeping like a well-fed snake. But a figure in a hooded coat stepped out of the darker dark, as if someone had unhooked them from a nail and set them down. They had the posture of a person who has practiced not disturbing dust. In one hand, tucked to the ribs, a book thick enough to be a small brick, wrapped in something that caught no light. In the other, a narrow case of the sort that holds brushes if you are a painter or a priest of small details. They moved as if each stone already trusted them. Marta brought the thermal to her eye and tracked the body heat through the fabric. Solid, no jitter in the hands. The figure went to Alvai's stone first, knelt without theatricality, and opened the brush case with the practiced quiet of a surgeon in a chapel. I could not see the face beneath the hood. I could see the hand. A compact hand with a restorer's grip, the fingers learned on narrow tools, the wrist steady without being rigid. They took out a fine brush, nothing that would impress a painter, and touched the tip to a small flask at their belt. Just a kiss of moisture. Then, with the concentration of someone reading aloud to a person who is asleep, they brought the brush into the letter groove and stroked once. Not hard, barely pressure. A line where any other eye would see no line at all. They touched the O, the A, the lower bowl of an R. Between strokes, they wiped the edge of the slab with a cloth folded in blue, small, quick swipes, a habit ingrained. Marta tapped the thermal, 2 light ticks. The surface heat signature changed in a way only a machine could love. The brushed grooves cooled a fraction faster than the surrounding stone. On my side, the motion camera's threshold tripped, and the red eyelid opened. The lens dilated, tiny and without pity. A moth drifted through the frame and was a ghost for half a second. The figure did not look up. I thumbed the radio, 1 squeeze for ready, and felt Marta answer with the same pressure from across the graves. The air tasted sweet for a moment, then medicinal like a pharmacy remembering it used to be an apothecary. Narrowly, that fat orange blossom note soft as a rumor. Under it, a resin that had learned to pray, myrrh. I logged the scent in the part of my brain that doesn't lose things. It matched the lab's trace. It matched Rose's shop. The figure finished with Alvai's stone, closed the brush case, and rose in a single motion that put no weight on the slab. They moved to Sister Katerina's grave and repeated the liturgy. Wet the brush, touch the grooves with the patience of a spider, wipe the margin with the blue cloth, fold it, tuck it, move on. The book under the arm stayed cradled. When they shifted their grip, the corner flashed a shine not of metal, polycover polished by too many readings. A rubbing folio my mind supplied, the sort conservators used to register letter depth and wear pages that carry ghost letters home. I counted the breaths between strokes. I counted the seconds between the thin bell and the arrival. The rising tide made itself known again at the outer wall. 3 licks, A pause, 3 licks. Like someone reciting from a catechism only water knows. The figure left Sister Caterina and crossed to Vittoria Malin. Knelt, touched, wiped. The cloth flashed blue against marble. That particular worker's blue that never quite leaves your hands even after you wash. Now, Marta's whisper said, more the shape of a word in the air than sound. I stepped out of the trees the way a floorboard steps out from under you. Carabinieri, I said, the syllables simple and public. Hands where I can see them. The figure froze without surprise. Just the stillness of a person who has practiced being a statue. The hood turned. A face within shadowed. A jawline that knew work. The brush lowered, as if coaxing a horse not to spook. Then, like a switch thrown inside a different weather, the figure detonated into motion. Not panic. Professional retreat. They pivoted away from me into the cypress lanes. Heels striking gravel in the only loud noise they'd permitted themselves all night. I went after them. Marta cut perpendicular, flanking, her boots making less noise than law allows. The figure ran with a skiffrower's economy. Short bursts, turns taken early, the way you do when you understand how corners break line of sight. They veered toward the side gate, then away at the last second, knowing I would predict and overshoot. I didn't. I had seen that trick in men who used alleyways as weapons. We threaded the column trees, our breath narrowing itself to keep our feet quiet. Twice the hood slipped. I saw the line of a throat, the gray of hair at the temple, or a trick of light. The book under the arm hugged tight. The brush case swung like a metronome. The blue cloth, loosened, hung from the figure's fingers by a corner. Stop, I called, because you are required to say certain words even when neither of you believes in them. The figure's left hand opened by a deliberate accident and let the blue cloth fall into my path. I didn't step over it. I stopped and stooped and took it, because evidence outweighs theatrics and the cloth would tell me more than a continued chase might. The weave was coarse, meant for polishing metal. The scent rose like a confession. Narrowly, yes, but under it myrrh, and under that a citrus-bitter resin that makes hands smell clean to liars. The fabric's edge was stiff with a dried, fine crust, salt-sugar-lime paste, faintly granular when my glove pressed it. Marta had pressed to the far side of the grove, trying to head the figure toward a blank wall. The figure knew the grove better than we did. At the last minute, they ducked through a gap cut for a maintenance path, slid along the wall, and bled back into the long dark that doubles as the island's skin. We reached the side gate in time to see only ordinary shadow. The bar was still in place. The counter had not tripped. Somewhere beyond the wall, water made the sound of somebody folding a large sheet slowly. We stood with our lungs pleading for decorum while the island returned to pretending it was empty. Did you get a face? I asked when my voice agreed to be useful. Not a full one, Marta said, scanning the thermal down the path. Height, about 178. Right-handed. Knees that don't crack when they kneel. Strength in the left forearm. I saw the flex when they clutched the folio. Not young, not old. Practiced. Smell, I said, and lifted the cloth an inch. She leaned, breathed, nodded once. Rosa's shop, she said, and a church. I bagged the cloth while my hands were still steady. Marta checked the paper seals on the chain we'd opened to enter. Intact. The cameras read. I winked the little wink that means it loved everything it saw and had saved it like a greedy witness. We returned to the stones because that is where the night had started telling truth. At Alvai's slab, the letters looked a shade paler along the same strokes as before. The paper witnesses I had laid now wore thin diagonal bruises of damp, top left to bottom right. The thermal clip still on the stake registered a small, obedient cool along the groomed grooves, cooling sooner, warmer, slower. At Sister Caterina's, the lower arm of the E had taken one more step toward surrender. At Vittoria's, the R's stem and curl looked almost confident. Same hand as last time, Marta said. Same recipe. They came to write a fourth warning and finish nothing. They came to write, I said, and to run. We swept the path of the chase for anything the figure had shed. A thread, a glint, a flake. Near the gap where they'd vanished, Marta found a skid of fine dust on the wall at shoulder height. Stone powder, marble bright when pinched between fingers even through a glove. I smelled my glove out of habit and caught a last thread of myrrh. By 4, the sky had decided to try being a color again. We locked the section, resealed the chain with fresh paper, and logged the time and the behavior and the temperature like parish clerks with a righteous streak. I sent the cloth to the lab with a note specifying narrowly and myrrh and asking for any trace metal from bronze work. I texted the patrol sitting on Roses Street, * eyes open. Don't be brave. Don't be asleep. Don't be seen. * a minute later, a reply, * awake. Quiet. Lamp at corner out since 02:00. * On the ride back across the channel, Marta poured 2 fingers of something from the thermos that wasn't coffee. We stood in the smell of diesel and salt and the small fear that comes from knowing the living borrow churches and chemistry when they run out of ordinary courage. Next time, she said. Next time we don't let them choose the direction, I said. We make the island smaller. In my pocket, the blue cloth's presence felt like a warm stone. It had the weight of a clue disguised as laundry. It had the shape of a hand that believed the island agreed with it. And it carried a smell that belonged to both a perfumery and a chapel, which is to say to Venice itself, which is to say to guilt dressed as ritual. The bell that had spoken at 3:11 did not repeat itself. It didn't need to. We had heard the hour. We had seen the hand. And we had a piece of the night the hand had used to wipe its work clean. Part 5, Ink That Isn't Ink. By mid-morning, the lab called me back with a voice that knew how to keep its coat buttoned. Esposito met me at the counter with the blue cloth already hooded inside a sterile pouch and a tray of reports that smelled faintly of acetone and coffee. Your ghost ink, she said, is not ink. We went point by point, the way you do when you need to burn superstition out of a room without opening a window. Composition, from the letter groove scrapings and the crust on the cloth's hem. Calcium hydroxide lime paste, sodium chloride, sea salt, sucrose, plain sugar, and a breath of essential oils, narrowly foremost, with trace myrrh and a bitter orange peel fraction that lengthens dry time. No modern polymer binder. No fluorescent resin. The ratios, by her estimate, favored hygroscopy over adhesion. It wanted air, not permanence. Paint it thin into the grooves, she said, tapping the report. And it will dry to a film so spare your eye forgives it. At a humidity rise between, say, 82 and 86%, the salt and sugar pull water fast. The film goes matte and you get your counterfeit letter. When the air steps back down, it returns to sleep. Application. The cloth edge carried parallel, fine ridges, evidence of repeated wiping against a hard edge, always at the same angle. On the thermal clips from the night, Esposito had mapped the cooling signature along the grooves. Strokes laid with a disciplined pressure, consistent length, and tight control at entry and exit. Not a shaky hand. Not a vandal smearing. A trained wrist, she said. Conservator. Gilder. Sacristan who has cleaned a chalice 10,000 times. Someone whose idea of charity is precision. The book. I slid stills across to her, the hooded figure, the angle of a corner, the way the arm protected it. She rotated the photo with 2 fingers and smiled. A rubbing folio, she said, exactly as my bones had hoped. Poly cover, telltale crease from being opened flat on stone. Paper inside will have talkative fibers, graphite ghosts if they rub too hard, friction burns at high strokes. If we find that book, your letters will be hiding in it like saints in a reliquary. She set down a second tray. Swabs from the blue cloth teased out microscopic bronze wax residue. Stearates and fatty acids used in metal polishing. Trace copper. A dusting of marble calcite not native to the cloth's weave. They've been handling bronze, she said. And marble. Possibly in the same week. I carried the data like a lantern to Arsenal, where the boatyards and restoration studios keep their own weather. Vivarini's workshop sat in a lane that smelled of old wood and younger arguments. The door stood open to a room of careful disarray. Scaffold poles, a torsioned winch, blankets laid out like votive offerings beneath a disassembled angel. On a bench, a bronze lion's head waited for someone to stop pretending the city wasn't watching it. Tommaso Vivarini came out, wiping his hands on blue sackcloth. The color matched my bagged sample exactly. He was taller than I'd hoped and calmer than I liked, with a restorer's careful arrogance. The sort of man who could take a thumb-sized flake from the corner of a 14th century panel and call it medicine. "Detective," he said, "we are closed for lunch but open to authority." "Authority prefers sandwiches," I said, and let him see my eyes take inventory. The sackcloth on his hands carried a pale dust like first snow. On the bench, a neat brush roll with sizes meant for borders and gilded letters. On a shelf, a stack of poly-covered binders, one thicker than the others, elastic-tired from use. The air, resin, oil, and the domesticated sweetness of beeswax. Under it, the faint ghost of Neroli, domesticated here by habit. "Do you keep rubbing folios?" I asked. "Of course," he said. "When we study inscriptions, we lift a map. Letters suffer, the way all things do when money touches them." "May I see your most used?" He looked at me as if I'd asked to borrow his mother. "Do you have a warrant to search the minds of the saints?" he said, a joke built for the men who laugh at his table. My silence was a warrant spelled differently. He picked up the thickest binder with a reluctant hand and set it down between us. Inside, tissue interleaves and sheets scumbled with graphite whispers. Names reversed in mirror, dates, a curling R that had learned its shape by repetition. Along the high strokes, the shoulders of R and N, the crowns of S, faint scuffs where paper had warmed from friction. In the lower bowls, the grain carried a ghost of crystalline dust, calcite in a crush too fine for accident. "You register the letter depth before you lay anything," I said, not asking. "Always," he said. "Otherwise you lose history." "Do you ever lay lime into grooves?" "Only to tone a repair," he said, without blinking. "With sugar and salt." He didn't answer. He had the decency not to lie badly. While his attention clung to the folio, my eyes did the rest. On a peg by the door, a church key hung on a habits cord, too large for any domestic lock. He saw my gaze, reached, and unhooked the key with a dry cough. "Loaned," he said, "for checking masonry on a chapel wall. Father Paolo is a friend. Friends should count their blanks," I said. "I did," he said. "I will," I said. I left him to count his blanks and take inventory of his own heart. On my way out, I brushed fingers, gloved, across his bench by accident. In that way policemen learn. Picked up a trace of blue wax and pocketed a microscopic voice. In the lane, I called Marta and set a tail on him with a rower who could breathe like stone and eyes that could wait. From Arsenal, I cut back to San Zaccaria. The perfumery felt cooler than the street, the way altars do. Rosa stood with a tiny brush, trailing a ribbon of scent into a bottle's mouth, and looked up with the calm of a woman who has decided what price she is willing to pay. "You found your cloth," she said. "I found a cloth," I said. "It knows more of churches than laundry." She lifted her hands to place the bottle on a shelf. Small, practical hands with crescent moons of pale dust tucked into the cuticles. Stone powder looks like clean skin until you learn its color. I took her hands as one takes a friend's hands who has heard bad news. The powder did not pretend. "Have you been on the island since we spoke?" I asked. "I pray where I can afford it," she said. "When the priests begin to look at me as if my grief owes them a receipt, I pray outside." "You've handled stone," I said. "I handle my son's name," she said, as if those words explained geology. I showed her the lab's list the way one shows a recipe back to the cook. Lime, sugar, salt, Neroli, myrrh. Her face didn't move in the obvious places. Her eyes did. Not to the words, those were old to her, but to my finger where it rested on Neroli. "Only I sell that blend," she said quietly. "The priest buys a cheaper note. The restorer buys what I recommend to people who think smell is a veil. I keep my own for memory." "Do you paint at night?" I asked because I had to make the floorboards creak. "I write warnings on stone," she said, steady now. "I do not drag men into water. I do not push. I am not the bell." She stepped around the counter and took a square of blue sackcloth from a drawer. Clean and used, frayed at one corner where someone had tested the weave. "These I buy for cleaning bottles," she said. "The bronze polishers buy the same. We are a small city that shares its color." I looked at her cuticles again, the hard-to-wash crescents. Stone dust doesn't cling without help. Lime wash dries in ridges tiny brushes make. I smelled myrrh on the cloth, narrowly in the air, and something else in the way the room held its breath. "Rosa," I said, soft enough that the shop bell didn't bother to listen. "We're going to talk now, kindly, precisely, and you are going to tell me what you meant the city to read." Her shoulders dropped, not in surrender but in relief that a line had finally been drawn in ink the living admit. She nodded to a chair that had been waiting a long time to be a witness. Grief can stage warnings and still not be murder. The island can write accents on a word someone else chooses. If I was going to charge a hand, I needed to know which hand stroked letters and which hand pressed bodies into wakes. The chemistry would not lie. The wrists would try. Interview Rosa, but keep the mind open. A ritual can be a signal someone else learned to weaponize. Part 6, Rosa's story. Rosa set the little chair like a stagehand, placing a prop, and sat with her knees square, palms flat on her skirt, as if she'd practiced the posture for a confession that no priest could broker. The shop was a cold bloom of orange and resin. Outside, the corridor water muttered its old monologue against stone. "I will not say I am innocent," she began, before my question could exist. "Only that my hands do not know the weight of a drowning." "Start where the letters began," I said. "They began when the city ended," she said. "The night after Marco went, the house forgot how to hold air. I took his shirt from the line and could not bring it in because it was still him. You understand? The salt he wore, the work. For days I did laundry that was not dirty. I wiped what was already clean. It felt as if I must scrub the water out of everything. And of course the water owns us." She reached into the drawer where the blue sackcloth slept and brought out a worn packet tied with string. The knot yielded to her fingers like an old friend. Inside, a novena, paper gone thin from folding, and a letter with edges furred by handling. She laid them on the counter as one lays instruments between doctor and wound. The novena's cover showed a mild saint with an impossible face. Within, 10 days of little disciplines written in a voice that imagined God liked lists. The letter wore Marco's name like a shadow. He had written it months before he died, a paragraph at a time on whatever paper made itself available. The back of a price list, a corner torn from a studio notice, one leaf with an oil spot in the shape of a coin. "Ma," it began, crooked and tidy enough to be hers by inheritance. Asterisk, "I am not clearing my throat at the dinner table, so do not scold me by letter. Tommaso says my hands are good and my speed will come. He says I must learn patience, which is what men say when they mean work faster but hide it. I worry about Alvise. He rose like he is making up for something he won't tell. Last night he tried to charge a tourist the price of a new moon, and when I joked he should bill me too, he laughed with his teeth. He rose drunk after 7. He says the wake will hold him steady. I say the wake belongs to the last idiot who passed. I told Sister Caterina I saw the church boat uncovered after Compline. She said she would hide the key in a better place. Vittoria came to the studio to talk about the gala and said, "Make it gleam." I don't care how. I told her gleam costs time. She told me time costs money and left a little envelope like it was a mint on a pillow. Asterisk. The ink stuttered where the pen had scratched a weak fiber. Asterisk. I am saving for the small polisher. Tommaso says I can borrow and pay him in work. He is proud in a way that helps and hurts. I am eating, Ma. Do not send money. When I finish the lion head, you will see the old city under the new city, and you will say, my boy's hands did that. I will come Sunday. Asterisk. He did not. What came instead was a phone call and a police voice brave enough to be gentle. Rosa folded the letter closed with a touch that blessed and punished. I went to San Michel, she said, because every woman goes to talk to the wall that will later carry her name. The cypresses listen. The stones pretend not to. And I thought, if the city will not carry what I am saying with my mouth, it will carry it if I write it in its favorite material. You know chemistry, I said. I know soap and scent and the way a smell rises or holds, she said. My sister's husband deals in lime for plaster. My brother kept a boat in winter. Venice teaches recipes to anyone who keeps her fingers open. I tested on a chipped slab behind the shop for a week. Lime thin like milk, sugar enough to want the air, salt enough to beg it, narrowly so I would smell my boy when I worked. Myrrh because I needed a thing that remembers death without worshipping it. And then I experimented with the morning, she said simply. I learned when the air would say yes. I went to the island with my small brush and a cloth because polite women do not drip. I did not write names whole. I am not a mason. I traced edges that would ask the stone to speak. I made the A forget its arm because the name deserved to stand for something else. I made the O narrow like a zero where a man's account was empty. I suggested a letter in another's epitaph. And do you see? I did not ask for death. I asked for reading. The city is a reader. It read. Her voice did not crack. It carried a grit that had to be learned. Tears rose without show and found the corner of her eye like water finds a low place. She did not blink them away. She let them sting. Did you tell anyone? I asked. Him, she said, and touched the letter, the way one touches a photograph to correct a rumor. And Father Paolo. He told me to let go, which is what men say when they do not want to see a woman carry weight properly. He quoted scripture at me about stones crying out. I said, good, then let them. He thought I was insulting him. I was applying his lesson. What about Tommaso? I asked. She nodded, as I knew she would. He came to pay respects before everyone remembered his temper. He loved my son the way a proud man loves a tool that might become a partner. He told me he had asked the police to scratch at the case again, and they had smiled with their teeth. He said if the city refused to speak, he would make it speak. He is a man who has spent too much time restoring saints. He thinks he gets to choose which miracles are permissible. Did you show him how? I asked. She closed her eyes and let the answer sit in the room first. No, she said. He smelled it on me. He recognized lime the way a butcher recognizes blood. He took the idea as if it were his because it made him feel like the island agreed with him. But I did not teach him. The island did. And he is old enough to have learned 1,000 little obediences from stone. You wrote on the night we watched, I said. We saw a hooded figure with a brush and a blue cloth. You carry the smell that cloth knew. Rosa smiled, a furious small thing. Detective, half the city carries that smell and half the churches carry the rest. But yes, I wrote the warnings. The figure could have been me on one night and not me on another. Do you understand? I went when the grief rose. Sometimes grief rises at 3. Sometimes it does not. The night your camera saw someone, I slept in the chair with my shoes on. You wrote Alvise, I said. You wrote Sister Caterina's. You wrote Vittoria's. I breathed on their stone, she said, her voice suddenly flat. I fingered the groove where the letter would accept a change, and I made a promise to the air. That is writing enough for the island. But I did not lay hands on their living throats. You will find that Tommaso's hands have the rope memory, not mine. You think he killed them, I said. I think he believes the island wanted a body for each letter, she said. And a man like that can always find a theology to excuse his wrists. He told me once, after the first letter brightened, that justice had a timing you could set a bell by. The next night, someone rang a little bell at a strange hour. Her gaze went to the novena as if it might stand up and scold her for speaking plain. I asked only for unveiling, she said, that a drunk boatman would admit he was drunk, that a sacristan would admit she hid a key she should have thrown in the canal, that a lady who needed shine more than truth would admit she was impatient with a boy's life. I wanted them to say it. I did not want them to drown in their secrets. But then one did, and then another, and I began to understand that I had given someone a stage and he had decided it was a gallows. Why continue? I asked, not gently, because gentleness has its own hypocrisies. If the first warning was followed by death, why write the second? Because stopping would have felt like agreeing with the city's first mistake, she said. with a hot clarity that made the shop's glass look like ice. Because grief believes in completion even when completion is a bad god. Because I was not the one tying knots or timing tides. Because I did not yet know his hands were practicing theology while mine were practicing grammar. She lowered her forehead to her fingertips, saint without altar. The room tightened to the sound of a boat's wake scoring the canal outside. A long, low scuff like a voice refusing to clear. "Rosa," I said, "you will be charged with tampering. You know this." "I know," she said. "I will scrub graves for a year with a toothbrush and accept that a priest will call it contrition. I will do it if it means you put iron on the wrists that throw people into water and call it liturgy." "Who else knew?" I asked. "Besides Paolo, besides Tommaso." "Johnny suspected," she said. "He looked at me once the way a father looks at his child when the sugar bowl goes light. He told me gently that candles unburned do not cast letters. He told me more gently that keys make bad music when they learn a song not theirs. He warned me the side gate had a bell in its heart. He did not say more. He is trying to survive his job with his decency intact." "Did Paolo give anyone a key?" I asked. "He gave Tommaso a blank," she said, "because priests think their paperwork absolves them when their charity fails. He said Tommaso needed to check masonry in the chapel. I told him the stones knew their weight fine. He told me to let the men do the men's work." Rosa's tears slid now, not the theatrical kind, the kind that simply needed a place to be. She wiped them with the back of a wrist that smelled like orange blossom in sleep. "I do not want mercy," she said finally. "Only accuracy. Write it down properly this time." Marco's letter named no murderer. He described carelessness and arrogance. The island brightened what I traced. A man used those bright strokes for fate. If the city must have a story, let it be the correct one. I bagged the novena and photographed the letter. Every crease, every oil blot, every place the pen had stuttered at a cheap fiber, then slid the original back to her with two hands. A mother's archive outranks a court's, in the hour before a court recognizes it. When I stood, she did too, small and uninteresting as the surface of still water, which is to say, hiding everything it carries. I left her with the ache of a bell somewhere that had learned the wrong time. Outside, the light had flattened into that Venetian gray that makes marble think it is paper. I called Marta and told her to tighten the tail on Tommaso and to be ready for a man who believes his weather is in charge. I texted a quiet note to the patrol at Rosa Street. * stay invisible. If anyone rings at her door after midnight, you will be arms and not sirens. *. Grief had staged warnings and refused murder. Somewhere else, a set of wrists had taken the staging and added rope. The letters on stone were grammar. The killings were argument. My work now was to separate the two and make both legible. Separate Rosa's warnings from the deaths. Whoever rang the bell and rode by tide has been piggybacking on her ritual. Part 7, the second hand in blue. The arsnail sleeps like a beast, breathing slow, mouth closed, one eye always open. Its lanes are a museum of work. Winches and pulleys, blocks of wood sprouting pegs like antlers, tarps that hold the outline of the thing they last covered. By noon I had warrants where I needed them and patience where I didn't. Marta met me at the studio door with a look that meant she had found an answer and was disgusted at its predictability. "Bronze wax," she said, and held up a baggie swabbed from the threshold. "Same styrates as the cloth. And look." She led me to the skiff moored inside the gate, its nose kissing a tire fender with the intimacy of old sins. Up close, the skiff told stories. The rubber matting on the floor wore two pale arcs where a man braces his feet when he hauls. At the bow cleat, a short length of rope had been coiled with a sailor's pride. A coil prettied for inspection, but the last 20 centimeters showed a different habit. A hard, fast twist with the tail bitten beneath itself. The kind of tie you throw in a hurry and promise to fix if life lets you. I pulled on gloves and examined the rope. It was 3-strand hemp, supple from use, with a peppering of salt in the lay like sugar on fried dough. Embedded in 3 fibers close to the end. A colorless glint you would never see if you didn't ask. Under Esposito's field lens, it admitted to being a polyester filament synthetic rope dandruff, consistent with the kind used on public moorings. The chafe patterns along the rope's bite matched. Not mathematically, nothing ever does, but like a twin raised in a different house. The wrist abrasions recorded on Alvai's autopsy. I bagged it and wrote the note the way a priest writes the name of a sin he knows by heart. On the gunwale, close to where a kneeling man would brace an elbow, a smear looked like a wrinkle in light. When Marta floated a cotton swab across it, the cotton emerged with the faintest liturgical blue. Bronze wax, she said, amused in the bleak way we are when the world refuses to invent new crimes. And a microflake of pigment. Blue on a sleeve, I said. We walked the studio as if it might decide to confess if we kept our footfalls quiet. The bench where I'd seen the brush roll now wore its tools with the defensiveness of a man expecting inventory. The sackcloth hung on its nail like a guilty flag. On a shelf above the folios, a pad of tide charts lay open, dates marked in pencil with the fussy elegance of a schoolteacher. Cross-referenced along one margin, someone had blocked out windows annotated not with hours but with little phrases. Wake covers, bell comfortable, fewer dogs. 3 of these blocks sat neatly beside the dates of our 3 corpses. Is this your handwriting, Tommaso? I asked when he came in from the yard, wiping his palms on his apron as if I were just another solvent. He looked at the pad and then at me, heavy with deliberation. The sea keeps its own calendar, he said. I take notes when the harbor behaves. It is a restorer's habit to learn the breaths of things. And to learn the city's soft hours, I said. The times when the water will blur a struggle, swallow a sound, pick a pocket of air out of a throat. He set his jaw as if it were a bead he could string on a wire. If you think I murdered anyone, say it in a sentence a court will understand. Not yet, I said. Right now I am interested in your permits. He produced them because he is a man who believes paper makes him clean. Night water authorization, a necessity for moving monumental pieces by barge when the wakes wouldn't close their teeth on you. The dates were legitimate. The hours were the sort Venice gives to men she considers useful, mostly midnight to 4. Do you go out alone? I asked. When I must, he said. Do you carry heavy things? When I must, he said again, and found a rag to fold to keep his hands from having to act. On the pad, one more entry caught my gut. A sketch of San Michel's perimeter, not precise. Tommaso is no draftsman, but intimate. A chapel marked with an X, the side gate with a dot that someone had traced twice deep. By the dot, a note. Asterisk, Paolo Keymatin's ring. Asterisk, the priest loaned you a blank? I asked the way a woman asks if a man has learned to call the weather by its name. Tommaso's I flicked toward a pegboard where keys that should have been catalog labels hung with the bland swagger of contraband. A large blank was missing. A smaller one had been filed down as if it had decided it wanted to be something else. The smell at that peg. A ghost of lime, a thread of myrrh. The bench below wore a glitter of stone dust finer than bread flour. I asked to check masonry, he said, tired of the theater of denial. Some stones in that wall weep. It can damage relics if the chapel is careless. You were careful, I said, with the wall, with your timing, with your theology. He met my eyes then, and I saw what people follow in a man like Tommaso. A zeal that imitates justice and forgets its pronouns. The boy's death was an indecency, he said. The city wrote a letter. Someone had to finish the line. You finished it with a rope, I said, and a tide chart. He didn't blink. I finished it with punctuation. Marta breathed out the kind of breath you let out only when a person makes you understand why the first stones were thrown in anger and the second in despair. We served the papers, we swabbed the surfaces, we lifted the folio and sealed it. In the spine, where the elastic had abraded the cover, Esposito would later find crystals of calcite and salt pressed so deep it would take a saint's patience to call it coincidence. We asked for Tommaso's phone. He handed it to me without a flinch because he believed his weather made him righteous. In the threads of his notes app sat 3 lists of windows. Minutes counted to and from bells at oratories that do not keep official hours, notations about patrol routes, a small smiley face beside the phrase "fewer dogs" that made me want to put my fist through his temper. "Why the bell?" I asked. "Bells are clean," he said. "They divide time into pieces God can count. And they make a good metronome for an ambush," I said. We left him with 2 uniforms and the knowledge that men like him grow more dangerous when they think the city might stop agreeing. Outside, the lane kept its collapsing hush. A boy, someone's apprentice, smoked a cigarette like he'd found fire and didn't know whether to sell it. From there, I took our pieces to places that would love them properly. Esposito ran the rope fibers against the micro from Alvi's wrists and said, "MM," in a tone that translates to not a marriage, but certainly an affair. She mapped the wax residue against Sister Katerina's sleeve scrapings, and the spectra leaned toward each other like a pair of thieves comparing alibis. The microflake from the skiff's gunnel, pigment blue, split under the scope into particles shaped like little plates. Prussian blue with a whisper of ultramarine, exactly the mix on a bronze polish favored by the studio whose receipts Tommaso signed. The skiff's matting wore salt sugar crystals in a distribution I could have traced blindfolded, concentrated where a kneeling man sets down a brush roll between strokes. Along its inner lip, I lifted a crescent of dried paste so thin a breath could have crushed it. Under the GCMS, it sang the same tune as our letters. He had laid his recipe where he worked. He had not thought to clean the chorus. A different question dragged me back to the city's quieter edges. I wanted to know whether Tommaso's weather had touched the dead the way it touched stone. The bruise on Vittoria's throat had recorded a pressure with a geometry a rower's hands often learn. Thumbs pressed laterally, not downward, fingers finding purchase near the mastoid. On Tommaso's left forearm, tendons still held the fatigue of a man who hauls more than he admits. When I asked him to lay his hands flat on the bench, he did so with a defiance that impressed his own shadow. The callus pattern matched a man who rose alone at night, inside palms fat, web between thumb and forefinger tough as old leather. "Do you pray, Tommaso?" I asked as we wrapped the last bag and Marta numbered the photo sequence. "I restore," he said. "It is the same. Prayer asks permission," I said. "Restoration pretends it already has it." He smiled a little because he thought he had discovered an ally in me. He had not. By evening, Venice had put on its gray coat and gone out pretending to be ordinary. I walked the fondamenta where Marco fell, the algae strip glistening like proof invented by the lazy. A barge went by and presented its wake to the stones, polite as a bow that hides a slap. I sat on the wall and reread Marco's letter in my phone's photos, the line about Alvi's drink, the line about the church boat key, the envelope on the pillow. The city has a way of letting the living braid their own hangman's rope out of favors they have forgotten to name. I sent 2 messages. To the team at the cemetery, * shift the cameras wider. Add 1 at the maintenance gap. Lower the motion threshold another fraction. Yes, that much. * to the pair sitting on Rosa. If anyone with a restorer's shoulders walks within 30 meters of her door, stop him with courtesy so sharp he bleeds on it. At dusk, I met Marta on a bridge where the canal narrows and all conversations adjust their volume without thinking. We watched a man in a hooded coat push a skiff with the impatience of someone who thinks the city owes him lanes. He didn't see us. He didn't need to. We already had the hour, the cloth, the rope, the wax, the blue. "Strong enough to throw a person into water," Marta said, speaking the line we both carried. "And pious enough to justify it," I said. She nodded toward my pocket. "And arrogant enough to keep a book of letters that will try to testify. The folio will sing when Esposito asks nicely," I said. "They always do." In the near distance, a small bell struck once. Not the city time, the island time, the private time of men who have decided their rhythm outranks the rest. I looked up, found the line of cypresses across the water in the last light, and felt the case pivot to its next hinge. Confront but don't spook. He's strong enough to throw a person into water, and pious enough to justify it. Part 8, Father Paolo's Key. The chapel behind San Michel's wall is a small stone throat that swallows whispers and returns them as incense. I found Father Paolo there at late afternoon, sleeves rolled, polishing a chalice until the brass considered honesty. He had a body like a rope over a beam, tension without volume, and a face made of duty and a little vanity. When he heard my step, he finished a circle with the cloth as if completing the orbit of a quiet planet, then turned and offered the chalice like a question. "Keep it," I said. "I'm here for your keys." He looked at my badge, which has learned to behave in churches, and then at the rack hung discreetly behind the sacristy door. He's old enough to have opinions. He unhooked a ring heavy with teeth and laid it on the linen like a small animal that might wake and bite. "The side gate," I said. "It opens with a chapel key." "It opens with God's permission," he tried automatically, then saw that my patience kept poor pew time. "Yes, it opens with one of ours." "How many copies?" "One," he said. "Two, if you count the one that isn't finished being a key." "Show me the one that isn't finished." He hesitated only the length of a litany and went to a drawer. Inside, on blue chamois, lay a blank cut to the church's old profile, but not yet filed to that exact persuasion old locks require. It wore a dusting of fine white as if it had slept in a mason's pocket. I touched the edge with a gloved fingertip and raised a crescent of lime. "Who has been checking masonry, Father?" He pressed his lips together, an organist finding middle C by memory. "A friend," he said. "A restorer. You know his name. I prefer to hear it from you. Tommaso Vivarini." The syllables sounded relieved to be out where the air could work on them. He asked to examine the wall near the side gate. "He says the stones weep, that the lime leaches." I loaned him the blank to fit while I was present. I did not. He caught himself on the skirt of a lie, intend that he should have it alone. Did he? Paolo's silence turned the chapel into an answer. Incense keeps its secrets in the rafters. I watched them not help him. "Bell at 3:11, I said. "A small one, not the city hour." "Where is it?" He led me to a cramped vestry where a hand bell hung from a nail. Brass, darkened where fingers hold it, a mouth with a memory. The clapper's tip showed fresh bright, a clean ring where metal kisses metal. He took it down with a lover's care and held it with his fingers webbed through the handle. Not by the top, the way men do who have wrung it often enough to learn its temper. "I ring for matins when I am awake," he said. "Sometimes the sisters prefer a bell that is not a town's. The island's hours are not always the city's." "Were you awake last night?" "I was," he said too quickly. "At 3:11? He flinched like a candle guttering. "Approximately." "Approximately is a courtroom's favorite hymn," I said. "Who else hears?" "The dead," he said, too pious by half. Then he folded, not morally, but structurally. Shoulders loosening, rib cage deflating by degrees. Rosa comes to the wall. "Tommaso," he asked for a vigil, for prayers said in the place where the boy rests. I thought if men prayed where they wanted justice, they might grow tired enough of their own voices to let God speak. "And so you lent a man a key blank and rang a private hour," I said. "I allowed a vigil," he corrected gently, priest to parishioner. "I did not intend to open a hunting season." We sat at a small table trimmed with linen so clean it could be used to settle arguments. He poured water as if it might forgive us both. I took the chair with my back to the wall and let him occupy the light. "Tell me about your sermons," I said. "The ones that quote stones." He looked surprised. Priests are always surprised when women listen. "I preached on Luke," he said. "If these were silent, the very stones would cry out." I said that truth will insist on being spoken, even when we bridle the mouths made for it. "Convenient for a man who wants to make the island pronounce sentence," I said. "I meant comfort," he said. "I meant that God sees what the city forgets." "And Tommaso heard permission," I said. "Rosa heard a task." He shut his eyes. I counseled them both, together once, separately often. I told her to release. I told him to rest. You know how men here rest. They make it an order for someone else to obey. "Did you ever walk with him to the gate?" I asked. "Once," he said. I brought the blank. We stood and looked at the hinges and spoke about lichen as if we were two scholars. He told me moisture rises under the stones like a psalm. I said I knew the psalms and that moisture has teeth. He smiled the way men smile when they are waiting for a bell. "Did you leave him there?" "I left him at the chapel to pray," he said, and the word pray curled on his tongue as if it were tired of being used as a bandage. I did not watch him walk to the gate. I did not hear the blank marry itself to a lock. I did not see him leave. I told myself that the island had enough eyes. "Johnny says the side gate counter never tripped," I said. "You know how to hold a bar so a counter lies?" He nodded, cheeks hot with a public shame. "You lift the pall," he said. "There's a hole on the housing's belly. A pin through and the ratchet forgets to count." The inventor of the counter was a genius. The inventor of the hole was a sexton late to supper. His hands worried the cloth on the table into a topography of guilt. I watched two powders reveal themselves on his skin when he pushed his palms together. A faint film of lime and the shimmer of bronze wax caught in the creases. I said nothing until his eyes followed my gaze. "I clean," he said weakly. "Do you also file blanks?" I asked. He opened the drawer again and placed a small file beside the key blank, as if the objects wanted to be a still life of complicity. The file's teeth wore a pale paste in the gullets. "Father," I said, very tired now, "you are in this, not with rope, but with doors and bells and homilies that men with arms mistake for trumpets. There will be a charge for unlawful access. Maybe an accessory after the fact if Tommaso used what you loaned to do what you pretended not to name." He bowed his head. Some men are built to bow. On him it looked like integrity remembered too late. "I allowed a vigil," he repeated, but the sentence had lost its halo. "I never expected the island to take blood." "It didn't," I said. "A man did." The chapel's air shifted the way it does when an afternoon decides it wants to be evening. Through the small window, the cypress tops inked themselves darker. He placed his palms flat, as if to receive an absolution he would not get from me. "I will give you the times I rang," he said, and retrieved a little notebook with dates and hours that played at neatness but had room for slippage. The entries kissed the windows on Tommaso's pad too often to be a lover's coincidence. "And I will help you close it." "How?" He looked at the bell. I looked at the bell. Between us, the idea stood up on its awkward legs and agreed to be named. "You will ring at 3:10, I said. "On the fourth night. Once. Then keep ringing every 2 minutes if we ask. We will sit where the dead sit. We will write our own letters. The island will read something else." He took a breath as if he had been underwater longer than he planned. "I will do what is asked," he said. "I will not preach." "Good," I said, standing. "Save the sermon for your superior." On my way out, I stopped at the key rack. I photographed the ring, the teeth, the order in which they hung, because men like Paolo put their conscience in order too, and it helps to know how. In the sacristy drawer, I photographed the blank and the file, the lime powder on blue cloth, the small grit of stone in the corners where someone wiped carelessly. I slid the drawer closed like a book you've finished but don't want anyone else to find right away. Back at the gatehouse, Johnny listened with the concentration of a man who has heard too many doors tell their stories to believe any one of them alone. We walked to the side gate in a silence that felt like training for the night's work. He showed me the ratchet, the little hole for the pin. I showed him the strip I would place to catch the lie if anyone lifted the pall. We rehearsed the difference between footsteps and weather. I called Marta and laid out the frame in a voice bare of romance. 2 teams inside the section, one by the maintenance gap, one behind Vittoria's stone. A third along the outer wall with line of sight to the side gate. A decoy on the fondamenta wearing a scarf like Vittoria's to pull the skiff into the open water where light and law are clean. Cameras lowered another hair. Thermal on. Radios quiet unless the word is stop. Rosa would be shadowed from door to pillow. A hand on her life so firm she could sleep in it if sleep still remembered her address. Venice leaned toward night like a conspirator. The island waited with its usual obedient patience. We would not let Tommaso choose the direction this time. We would ring his hour for him and see if he came to kneel to the law he had mistaken for a sacrament. Set a controlled watch with decoys to catch Tommaso at the 4th attempt. Part 9, 4th night, false epitaph. We made the island smaller. By midnight, the section lay inside our hands like a folded map. Cameras watched from the cypress knees. Thermal lenses stared with their unblinking animal calm. The chain at the gate wore a fresh paper seal annotated with a hairline mark where a liar's pin would enter the ratchet's little belly. Johnny moved like a man translating for the dead. Marta checked radio checks without speaking, a finger raised, a nod, our grammar for the hour. On the fourth headstone, new family, old marble, I laid my own recipe into the letters, the way a teacher writes on the board for a class that would rather be sleeping. Lime skimmed to a milk, salt and sugar at a ratio that wants but does not beg. A breath of narrowly to mark the air with memory. But where Tommaso had coaxed accusations from grooves, I wrote a word the island could not misunderstand. In the lower line of the epitaph, a place no mason had cut for anything after light, I traced a geometry whose dawn would spell stop when the humidity rose. The S curled like a warning. The T planted its small cross in the groove like a stake. The O closed itself with patience. The P would bloom a narrow stem and a belly if the air obeyed me. The stone drank the thin wash and forgot it immediately. Good. Across the water, a decoy walked a route on the fondamenta that had made a habit of death. Slight figure, hooded coat, Vittoria's scarf pinned loose so it would flash in the dark with that expensive carelessness rich women practice. Two plainclothes rowers drifted shadow clothes in a low skiff, oars resting on thole pins wrapped to keep their mouths shut. Another team waited where the canal opened to cleaner light, nets and hands ready for the sudden doctrine of force. Rosa slept at last, if that narrow stillness could be called sleep, under a patrol's thin angel wings. We took positions. Marta by the maintenance gap, her back to a blank slab, the thermal to her eye like a second, less forgiving pupil. I settled into the cypress shadow across from the false epitaph, radio warm against my collarbone, the bell's imagined tone already vibrating in the arch of my foot. Johnny sat in the gatehouse with a thermos and a list of the names of the dead arranged the way a caretaker arranges tools, with respect and order. The island breathed. At 2:58, a breeze a child could ignore trickled from the northeast. Humidity climbed a rung it had been considering. The cypress above me shook out a whisper that sounded like not yet. On the maintenance wall, a lizard too young to understand discretion blinked and decided to pretend it was a relief carving. I checked my watch. Marta touched her ear. 3:10, the bell. One single, decisive note from the vestry, the hour we had chosen for him. A clean circle drawn in air. He came to it. The side gate's shadow swelled and separated into a man who thought shadows owed him privacy. Hood up, coat close, the stride of someone who begins most days with work and ends most nights with the same. He carried the brush case and the thick folio like a sacrament. A small bag rode his hip, canvas worn where corners live, heavy enough to swing with its own ideas. He did not test the chain. He already knew the chain. He slid through the maintenance gap we had left looking casual and wrong, as practiced as if it were his own door. Tommaso Vivarini moved to the new stone with a restorer's economy. Kneel, open, kiss the brush to a small flask, guide the tip into the groove. His hand did not shake. The breath he laid into the letters was the steady breath of a man with a metronome for a conscience. The blue cloth flashed and wiped. The brush touched the second stroke. The cloth tucked back, his fingers making that old bluing gesture that never leaves a studio. He worked 3 graves in quick liturgy, Alvai's, Caterina's, Vittoria's, then stopped at the 4th, the one he had not yet taught to speak. He leaned so close that the hood hid his face and the world had to learn his intent through his hands alone. He stroked once near where my S slept, twice near the false epitaphs period. The thermal registered what I already tasted, the grooves cooling a breath faster than their neighbors, a signature no priest would recognize but every saint of physics would sign. He set the brush case down and stood, rolling his shoulders, the way a man does before he lifts something that will not writhe if he is merciful. Marta's finger traced a small circle in the air at me. Ready. He left the stone to its future and slipped away the way tide slips. Present even when you think it isn't. Through the gap, along the outer wall. He bled back into the long dark where water waits for anyone arrogant enough to test its patience. We followed but not close. Our choreography had been written earlier, in a room where coffee had cooled without being loved. On the fondamenta, the decoy came into view. Backlit by a weak lamp, scarf lifting a little in the night's breath. The skiff nudged from a mooring and slid after, its bow down, its oarlocks dressed in cloth so no gossip would carry. Tommaso rowed with the small, powerful motions of a man who has done it at unsentimental hours. No show, all work. His eyes read the wake around the decoy the way a butcher reads the color of a cut. He matched pace. He let the skiff drift up to the stone, and then, with a motion he had rehearsed in every word he'd used to justify himself, he rose and reached, rope in his hand already made into a loop that pretended not to be what it was. His weight shifted to the bow. The decoy's shadow stepped aside in that same second, and the world brightened. Light climbed the wall as if God had remembered he had shutters. Our lamps opened the scene in a white that made fiction irrelevant. Carabinieri, I said the word like a nail. Marta's beam nailed the skiff's ribs. 2 officers took the bow and stern with hands that know the difference between catching and drowning. Tommaso flinched and went for his pocket where men keep knives. He found instead a gloved hand with a wrist lock that refiled his theology under pain. He did not fight like a coward. He fought like an ideologue who has forgotten that wrists are simply wrists. In that short, ugly struggle, the rope kissed my sleeve and left a salt smell I will not forgive. The loop dropped to the stone and lay there like a small, sleeping accusation. When the light convinced his muscles we were not going to ask twice, he stood down. "Tommaso Vivarini," I said, breathing like a human being again. "You are under arrest on suspicion of 3 counts of homicide, attempted homicide, and conspiracy, among other things that will lose their poetry in court." He looked at me and gave me the polite contempt men reserve for women they will not let be their judges. "You are stopping a sentence the island began," he said. "It will write it without me." "You supplied the handwriting," I said. Marta took his bag. Inside, river stones wrapped in rags for waiting, a brush roll with the sizes we had already met, vials with our old friend's lime, salt, sugar, a smaller vial that admitted to bitter orange, a folded page from his folio with a list of names in a hand that wanted to be sacramental and failed. Alvise, Caterina, Vittoria, and beneath, a 4th line not yet blessed with ink. Beside each, tied windows, bell notations. The little joke of fewer dogs repeated as if the island's animals owed him their silence. I walked him back toward the maintenance gap, past the stone where the false epitaph waited for the air to lift its letters out of sleep. He turned his head toward it as if he could will the dawn to hurry and prove him right. "You can't stop what has already been written," he said. "You can stop writing it," I said, and nodded to the chain. In the gatehouse, Johnny watched us pass with a face that had made a sacrament of neutrality. The ratchet counter sat honest. The paper seal showed no tears. The tiny pinhole I had marked with a pencil stayed just a dot. Father Paolo's bell, back in its drawer, remembered nothing out loud. Our cameras had eaten the night and grown fat on it. We shackled Tommaso with the practical tenderness you keep for dangerous men when you need their wrists to arrive at court without new bruises. He stared at the folio bagged in Marta's hands with the longing of a man who has misplaced his scripture. "You don't understand," he said, as if declaring understanding were his privilege to award. The boy deserved an answer. The city needed a sentence it could bear. "The city can bear trials," I said. "It can bear charges. It can bear the truth that a drunk man's hands shake and a sacristan hid a key and a patron bribed silence. It cannot bear you deciding who drowns when bells ring." We put him in the boat. The lagoon took the weight the way it takes all weight, indifferent and ferocious at once. Before we cast off, I walked the few steps back to the 4th stone. The air had reached its hour. Condensation laid itself down along the edges I had drawn. The S ghosted up first, then the T, the O closing with a humility the island could accept, the P lifting its stem like a warning flag. Stop stood there, pale, absolute, more instruction than plea. Tommaso stared at it and smiled with a sadness that would have been moving on a man who didn't carry rope. "You think the stone obeys you," he said. "It obeys air," I said. "And the air obeys the hour. Tonight the hour belonged to us." He looked past me at the cypresses that have not cared for any of us since the Republic learned to count. "The island will finish the sentence without my hands," he said, gentler. Maybe, I said, but tonight it will finish nothing. We left 2 officers to collapse our stage, to roll cables and cradle cameras and gather paper strips that would soon be only souvenirs of a weather that matters. I rode with Marta and Tommaso to the pier, the bag with his stones at my feet heavy in a way that makes you think of pockets and riverbeds. At the dock, uniforms closed in with the brisk pity of men who have done this too many times, and we delivered him into the metal grammar that governs men when their weather ends. Studio, I said to Marta. Once paperwork had played its part for this hour. We pull it apart to the screws. Anything that breathes stone or wax or salts, we bag. Anything that talks about bells, we copy. If he has a saint's calendar for murder, I want to nail it to a courtroom door. She nodded, tired, her hair remembering it had been clean once. And Paolo? She asked. He rings when we tell him, I said. And then he writes down exactly how he helped without believing the word help belongs to him. The sky on the east edge of the lagoon had begun to discolor with the promise of morning. A gull wrote its lazy profanity across the air and was not arrested. In the distance, the cemetery's wall made its usual honest line. Behind that line, our false epitaph faded a fraction as the dew began to retreat, but the word remained legible enough for anyone who needed it most. With Tommaso caught, search his studio for links to the 3 deaths. Part 10, Confession and the Island. Interviews begin the way tides do. Little pulls, then the large drag. We put Tommaso in a windowless room cooled to honesty and set the recorder on the table like a small, tired god. He did not ask for a lawyer. Men who believe the city agrees with them often assume the law will eventually remember to fall in line. He sat straight, hands flat, wrists cuffed forward to keep him from imagining they were wings. The rope smear on my sleeve had dried to a faint salt I could taste when I licked a cracked lip by habit. Marta took the chair by the wall, pen ready, gaze dry. I began where those who drown others least like you to begin, with the dead. Alvise Soranzo, I said. Tell me why his wrists wore the harbor. Tommaso's jaw worked once, the idea of chewing on words that would not feed him. Because he rode drunk when a sober man was needed, he said. Because he let the boy's head meet stone and then told the water to do the rest. Why his wrists? I repeated. I tied him, he said finally. No romance, no passive voice. At the mooring where a wake would drag him clean of the stone and keep the bruise patterns tidy. A loop over, a turn under. He struggled like a man who could not tell whether he deserved it. I offered him a prayer. He refused. He refused air, Marta said, writing. The prayer was yours. He accepted the correction with a small nod that made my hands want to learn new work. I chose my hour, he said. The tide made the rest credible. Sister Caterina, I said. A chapel. A collapse. A ring of blue on the sleeve. The blue, he said with a craftsman's pride, was wax, bronze wax from the lion head. She came to the studio after Compline, curious, as if saints were gossip. I told her key had been used to unlock a boat that night. She told me the church keeps its own minutes. She touched the lion out of habit. I pressed the cloth over her mouth and nose just long enough for sleep in a chapel's silence. When she fell, her sleeve brushed the waxed bronze. It is, how do they say? Transfer. Not murder, I said softly. Transfer. He looked at me with a martyr's patience. I did not strike her. Heart and hour took her. God took her. You set the hour, I said. 3 witnesses dead makes a theology only in the mind of a man who thinks tides lift absolution. He did not rise to it. Zeal wears armor where other men keep skin. And Vittoria Malin, I said. A private gondola, a wake, a bruise at the throat. She hired men to smooth her mirrors, he said. She paid for silence when the boy died. I met her on the fondamenta she pretended to own. When the private boat turned to present its clean side to the view, I stepped up from the skiff and put my thumbs where every restorer learns to place pressure without leaving an obvious signature. The swell did the rest. The city told itself a story about a rich woman's heart. It enjoys those. It will enjoy you less, Marta said. I let the recorder count 3 seconds, the way a bell counts a small, persuasive hour. You wrote on stone, I said. You knelt at graves and laid a recipe that made letters move. He didn't deny it. Rosa taught the city to read the first word, he said. I gave it punctuation. Rosa breathed grief onto marble, I said. You breathed murder into water. He frowned as if I had mangled grammar. The island agreed, he said. Even when I did not prime the letters, they sometimes shifted. I've seen it, little halos at dawn on stones no one touched. You can't call all of it mine. The caretaker's ledger notes that on certain tides the stones weep, I said. A natural capillary effect. A phenomenon, not a verdict. You turned the physics into a liturgy you liked. He shifted in his chair, the first discomfort his spine had allowed. The bell at 3:11, he said, as if making a small confession that would win him points for accuracy. It was ours. Paolo rang. Men need a metronome. We all do. Paolo gave you a blank, I said. The side gate. The counter's pawl can be lifted if you know where to put a pin. You lifted it. You called that permission. I called it access, he said. Permission is a word for people who prefer forms to acts. I let the list of evidence arrive like cold air. Your skiff matting carries salt sugar paste, I said. Your rope's chafe matches Alvi's wrist abrasions to the degree the world permits matching. Blue wax on the sleeve of a sacristan is the same mixture you signed for in studio receipts. Pigment grains in Vittoria's wound crest, Prussian with a breath of ultramarine, match the polish on your bench. Your folio holds letters that show friction burns at the high strokes and calcite dust in the bowls. Whispers from the island you took home because you cannot bear to do a thing without keeping a relic of it. He lifted his chin to the room's bad light. You have your artifacts, he said. They deserve a story. They have one, I said. It ends with wrists and a dock. Passes by a court. He looked puzzled for a breath, then serene in the way men become when they begin composing the poem they'll recite to themselves in prison. I confess to the three, he said. I tried the fourth and you prevented it. The bell and the key were lent, not stolen. The letters were a catechism. Rosa's acts were not murder. Her warnings were useful. She should be thanked, not punished. She will be charged with grave tampering, I said. She will scrub your ghosts from stone with a toothbrush and call it community service. Paolo will face his superior and the law for unlawful access, an accessory for the doors he opened and the hours he rang. He smiled almost kindly. He will be reassigned, he said. The church is a city that survives cities. Marta closed her notebook and slid the forms across to him. He signed as if authentications were just another discipline of restoration. His signature was neat, the hand of a man who insists his notes might be read in 100 years. When I stood, he tried one last time to recruit me to the weather. You cannot stop letters, he said. Salt will write, and stone will answer, and the island will push its breath where it wishes. Men like me are only ever an instrument. Men like you are hammers that think they are harps, I said. The island will do as it does. The law will do as it must. We moved him to holding. The chain sang a little on the way out of the room. Chain always does. I left Marta to coordinate the studio search. Screws to bag, Tide pads to copy, every brush to swab, while I walked to San Michel for a morning that had decided to dress as mercy. The fourth stone still held our word. Faint now, the stop softened to a pallor that looked like good sense. Johnny stood with his cap in his hands and his face relieved in the way caretakers get. A relief that counts the living and prefers them upright. Is it finished? He asked. Finished enough for a court to begin, I said. We will document, wash, reseal. Then you will go back to mending paths and counting candles like a man who tends the living by tending their addresses. He made the sign of the cross and then, remembering, made only an upward shrug. The bell? He asked. Paolo will ring when told for the paperwork and not again for the wrong reasons, I said. We made him useful to the truth. Now he will be useful to discipline. Esposito met us with a mobile kit, her plums-dark nails impatient with superstition. We took final casts of grooves, measured humidity, captured one last swab of the lime film from a place where Rosa had admitted she wrote. The bench sample from Tommaso's studio, blue wax, sang the same spectral hymn as the fleck we'd brushed from Sister Caterina's sleeve. The rope fiber comparison resolved into language any juror could hear. Not identical, but cousins in a small town. The folio pages, the folio, carried on their tissue a dozen names in mirror, including our three, including Marco. His letters reversed and present, as if Tommaso had wanted to hold the boy's name the only way he knew how, stolen from stone. By noon, the paperwork could stand. We filed preliminary charges. Tommaso Vivarini, 3 counts of murder, 1 count attempted, conspiracy, abuse of a corpse for the post-mortem manipulations, unlawful night operations beyond permit scope. Father Paolo, unlawful access, accessory after the fact in allowing the gate and hour to be used, to be weighed by a court with whatever mercy priests can still ask for as citizens. Rosa Dandolo, vandalism of graves, tampering, acts deemed non-lethal but consequential, a recommendation for community service at the cemetery and a caution that any further ritualization would carry weight beyond symbol. Before I closed the binder for the day, I took the water taxi alone to the north edge of the island and stood beneath a cypress that had outgrown every argument. The air was river cool. I put no brush to stone. I laid no traps. I breathed. Capillary action is not a ghost, but at certain hours it plays one convincingly. On a stone whose epitaph contained the word Pete with grave, a faint halo at the diacritic kindled and dimmed of its own will, the air doing what air does, the salt waking and sleeping, the letter showing its edge because the hour had asked gently. No hands, no chemistry with ambition, just the island at its patient trick. I wrote it in my notebook without romance. Asterisk natural halo observed at 6:13. No applied films. Humidity high. Phenomenon noted. Asterisk then, because a mind is a poor place to store certain things, I added the sentence I'd let myself think only once. The island can accent. Men choose words and deeds. On my way back through the gate, Johnny showed me the counter. Truthful, hole. The little hole below the ratchet stared up like a healed wound. I placed my palm on the wood of the door and felt it keep its promise without sighing. At headquarters, the paperwork moved with its own tide. The city's papers, the church's letters, the court's forms, we shepherded them until they moved with ambition. Tommaso sat in his cell with his eyes half closed, lips moving, perhaps composing his future into a thing he could inhabit. Paolo took off his stole and ate in silence with men who pretended not to see the empty ring on the key rack. Rosa swept her shop with a blue cloth that would no longer promise her anything she couldn't name. We had the men we needed. The island could breathe in its own way again. Only one small, uninvited echo remained, like the last ring of a bell long after the rope has stopped. One loose end. The small, unplanned letter changes Rosa didn't make. Minor halos that no hand seemed to set. Hallucination, or something the island has always done when the tide is right. Part 11. What the stones still do. The dawn that followed our arrests came up shy, the kind Venice gives to people who have been awake too long. I went to San Michele alone, the custodian's ledger tucked under my arm, its brown pages keeping their secrets with the stubbornness of old paper. The island was all breath and no words. I let it lead. Marco's stone stands where a cypress casts a thin ladder of shadow. At that hour the light had not yet climbed it. I left my torch off, moved slow, permitted no chemistry. No brush, no cloth, no ritual. Just a body and its questions. I stood close enough to read the grain. No paste glistened in the grooves. No fine lime ridges traced a hand's passing. The epitaph held its simple obedience, name, dates, a small line that someone had chosen because the undertaker's booklet offered it. Requiem aeternam dona ei, Domini. Below, a single word that had made Rosa fold into herself the first time she saw it. Pete with grave. The air was thick enough to encourage honesty. Somewhere across the water, a gull opened its mouth and the sound arrived late, like a letter that had learned better manners on the way. I watched the word and the stone watched me, and then the faintest film rose. Nothing a camera would brag about, all capillary modesty. Around the accent mark on the A in Piete with grave, salt crystals drank and showed themselves as a halo the size of a thumbnail. It brightened softly. Then, as the light climbed a rung and the air stepped down a degree, it dimmed. No letters moved. No theology completed itself. Just marble waking, the way stone does when the hour brushes it politely. I wrote it soberly in my book. Asterisk 06:13, 06:16. Capillary brightening observed on diacritic of Paetier with grave. No applied film, no manipulated groove. Air humidity 91 to 89%. Phenomenon consistent with ledger notes, page 217. Asterisk I added a second line a little more human than procedure usually allows. If anyone wishes to be haunted by this, the island will oblige without help. Back at the gatehouse, I opened the caretaker's ledger to the page I had marked earlier. The hand belonged to a man I never met. The ink belonged to a bottle that has been dust for a decade. Asterisk, on certain mornings, the letters appear brighter at the edges. Humidity very high. No vandalism observed. Visitors remark on it. We call it the stone's weeping. Father says it is piety. I say it is physics. Asterisk, I copied the phrasing into my file verbatim. The court likes such sanity. Johnny came to stand beside me and did not pretend not to be relieved. You saw? He asked. I saw what stones have always done when air and hour agree, I said. Nothing that changes a charge. Enough to let a person speak of it for the rest of their life if they need a song. He nodded, then went to sweep pine needles from a path that had never once asked to be dramatic. I walked the section where Rosa had worked and where Tommaso had knelt. The letters we had watched had gone back to obedience. No phantom arms grew, no R invented itself. Our paper seals were broken and replaced by documentation. The cameras were down. The cypresses went on with their tall, unimpressed business. The island looked like itself again. I wrote the memo that would go into the case file as an appendix, the kind of thing junior officers skim and then look up a year later when a rumor demands grammar. Observations on capillary effects in marble at San Michel. Scope, limits, misinterpretations. I described limewash's habits and hygroscope's appetite. I defined the narrow weather in which letters seem to brighten without a hand and the tighter, more suspicious weather in which a hand's recipe makes accusation visible. I recommended preventive maintenance, gentle washing, documentation under grazing light, control stones as baselines. I suggested the cemetery adopt a formal policy on ritual tampering, with procedures to involve the carabinieri before anyone decides to outright the city. Near the chapel, I found Paolo with sleeves rolled, drying chalices with an uncharacteristic care that didn't beg to be seen. He looked thinner in the morning, as if the night had filed him down. He did not sermonize. He said, "You went to the boy," and I said, "Yes." He asked nothing about halos. I left him to learn new hours. Rosa arrived late, dressed in the kind of clothes that offer penance without exhibition. She stood outside the wall, not crossing the threshold, and watched the cypresses hold up the sky. I didn't call to her. We both had work. Mine with forms, hers with the practice of continuing to exist. When she left, the air kept the place she had occupied like a bookmark you can't see but feel when you close the book. By midday, the section was resealed. We photographed every stone. We washed the letters with distilled water and soft cotton, lifted the pastes that had been laid, and noted where the grooves still kept a whisper of someone's intent. The word stop on the fourth stone had faded to the sort of remnant a mason would call a nuisance and an investigator would call enough. We logged it, scrubbed it, logged that we had scrubbed it. I filed one last page because stubbornness can be useful when it's dressed as thoroughness. Closing note, I wrote, asterisk, we observed minor, unplanned brightening at dawn on at least one stone with no applied films. This aligns with prior caretaker observations and known physics. It does not alter the causal chain in the deaths of Soranzo, Sister Caterina, or Malin. The island can accent. Men chose words and deeds. Asterisk. Then I signed it with my name the way a person signs something they are willing to be responsible for when the file comes off the shelf in 5 years and a young officer asks whether stones can indict the living. The lagoon made its old argument with the wall, polite and relentless. A gull dropped something stolen and did not apologize. The bells across the water kept time again with the rest of the city. I closed my notebook and let the island return to being a place where the dead keep their addresses and the living learn to read them without rewriting the lines. Closed the case with clean charges and a careful memo. Final part, the stone that spoke of guilt. We built the case like a seawall, one block, then the next, each fitted tight so that wake and rumor slid off it. By the time the magistrate called us into chambers, the paper had its own momentum. Rope fibers and tied notes, bronze wax spectra, pigment shards, folio ghosts. It was ugly and sufficient. Justice often is. Charges, we filed them clean. Tommaso Vivarini, 3 counts of murder, Soranzo, Sister Caterina, Malin. 1 count attempted murder, conspiracy, abuse of a corpse for the manipulations that restaged the dead as sermons, unlawful night operations beyond permit. Father Paolo, unlawful access to a restricted site, accessory after the fact for enabling entry and hour, to be weighed with whatever mercy attaches to negligence dressed as piety. Rosa Dandolo, vandalism of graves, tampering, her warnings separated in law and in narrative from the killings they unintentionally made more legible. Evidence summary. The rope from Tommaso's skiff spoke the harbor's dialect. Chafe that rhymed with wrist abrasions, salt crust where a mooring bites back, synthetic lint from public lines. The blue on the sacristan's sleeve turned out to be bronze wax from the lion head he kept for prestige, cut with the very Prussian, ultramarine blend his receipts itemized. The skiff mat carried a scatter of salt, sugar, lime crystals right where a kneeling hand sets down a brush roll. 1 crescent of dried paste flowed under GCMS into the exact tune our letter grooves had sung. His phone held tied windows annotated with unfunny jokes. His folio carried mirror letters whose bowls kept calcite and halite like contraband dust. The bell times in Father Paolo's notebook kissed those windows too often to pass as coincidence. The side gate blank wore lime in its teeth. A small file from the sacristy drawer kept that lime like a whisper it couldn't swallow. We did not bring ghosts, only the heirs' habits and men's. The cemetery closed the section long enough for a wash respectful enough to count as an apology to no one in particular. Conservators from another district, not Tommaso's, documented the slabs under a clean grazing light, lifted and catalogued every pasted stroke Rosa had admitted to. The word stop on our decoy stone faded to a suggestion you could miss if you wanted to, which the cemetery was happy to do after we logged it twice. Then the stones were rinsed, photographed again, and left to behave like marble. When the city is done with you, it returns to its chores. The lagoon rehearsed its breathing. The markets argued about anchovies. The bells, now that Paolo kept to the public hours, learned to join the rest. I wrote the closing memo, the one that will get pulled by some recruit in a lean year and read with the fatigue of a person who has been awake since a call no one should enjoy receiving. Ferraro, Lucia, observations and conclusions in the matter of letters at San Michele. I kept it plain. The trick, the recipe, the hours that act like doors if you know which way to push. The difference between accent and authorship. The narrow gap in which grief can become a sign and someone else's faith in force tries to pass for justice. When the hearings began, Tommaso came in with the righteousness of a man who thinks confession is a stage and a verdict a misreading. He glanced at the folio on the evidence table the way a parishioner glances at a relic, possessive, wounded. His lawyer built a seawall of words. No intent to kill here, an unfortunate collapse there. A struggle that coincided with a swell elsewhere. The wall leaked, tides love a gap. When Esposito spoke, her charts emptied the romance out of the room. Ratios do that. When Johnny described the ratchet's little belly and the lie a pin can teach it, the judge did not need a diagram. When Paolo admitted the hour and the blank and said, without plumes, I allowed a vigil. The court had the shape of the offense the way a hand knows a bruise. Rosa came last. The prosecutor wanted theater. She offered grammar. She said what she had done, in a voice with no italics. A thin wash of lime, a dust of salt and sugar, a breath of narrowly to make grief tolerable by smell alone. She did not flinch when the clerk read vandalism of graves. She did not look at Tommaso. She kept her gaze on a point in the courtroom where you could pretend a window looked at water. The court made its arrangements. Tommaso went where iron keeps ours clean. Paolo received the paper men write when they have run out of formulae for regret and must borrow some from discipline. Reassignment would come slow, then suddenly. Rosa was sentenced to community service. Here, of all places, under rules that would make future letters more difficult to persuade. She nodded to the terms as if they were the correct length for a punishment that fit only partly. After the last clerk had dragged the last cart down the corridor, I walked back to San Michel because you go where the case began when you want to make sure the ground still holds. The cypresses accepted my return the way a stoic accepts a glass of water. In the gatehouse, Johnny was measuring the world into lists. He had written new log at the top of a page and underlined it once. "We'll keep controls," he said. "A baseline stone every quarter. Humidity notes. Photographs at dawn on the bad tides. It helps my sleep to have a box to put this in." "Good," I said. "Men sleep better when physics wears a uniform." We walked the rinsed row. The stones were themselves again. Stubborn, obedient, dull in a way you learn to trust. On Marco's, the word that had won and wounded Rosa, *** with grave ***, looked as honest as chisels get to be. I stood a long time without stooping. The island's morning was cool enough to make anyone a believer in restraint. "Contessa Mallon's family sent a letter," Johnny said, almost apologetic. "A donation for landscaping. They asked if we could plant something that blooms in winter." "Plant cistus," I said. "It pretends to be fragile and isn't, like most of us." At the chapel, Paolo was polishing a candlestick without confiding in it. He nodded as if greeting the floor. He would ring public hours for a while and learn how to let silence do work without recruiting it. I left him to it. Men learn more slowly than bells. When I reached the fourth headstone, the one that had carried stop like an order, I found it simply clean. Air had gone back to being air. I pressed my thumb lightly to the groove where the pea's stem had liked to drink. Dry. Innocent. The island does not hold grudges any more than water remembers a specific hand. It just keeps its laws and lets us disgrace ourselves against them or not. A gull scissored a cry across the wall. The lagoon wrote its palimpsest against the steps, line over line over line. Venice is a document you can never finish reading because the ink will not dry, and even if it did, salt would bloom through it. I gave the place what gratitude I could manage, which took the form of leaving it alone. Johnny locked the gate with an ordinary key used at an ordinary hour. The counter clicked once, honestly. He hung the ring on its hook. The hook accepted it with the contentment of metal used for its purpose and not recruited into a liturgy. On my way back to the Vaporetto, I wrote the last line for the file. It is not art, and it is the closest I have to a benediction. Salt writes boldly, but only where a hand tells it where to sit. The island will keep brightening edges on certain mornings. People will keep pointing and saying they saw a miracle. They will have physics at its old patient trick. Sometimes that is miracle enough. If any other hand wishes to teach marble to accuse, they will find rope and paper waiting for them in the place men go when they forget that truth is not improved by drowning. I boarded at Fondamenti Nove, the city spreading itself into daylight like someone putting on a shirt they own but do not always love. Marta texted a single word. ***, filed ***, and I let my shoulders lower a centimeter. Somewhere a perfumery doorbell chimed. Somewhere a shop swept with a blue cloth that now meant only glass and goodwill. Somewhere a small church learned to keep its minutes like everyone else. Back across the water, the cypresses were green candles again, and the wall did what walls do when the right cases end. It held. End of story. Venice breathes again. The stones are quiet, the water is only water, or at least, that's what we choose to believe until the next tide writes something we didn't permit. If you've stayed with us this far, through salt and candlelight, through the voices that learned to speak from marble, thank you. Stories like this one remind us that guilt never sleeps, and sometimes the world needs someone willing to listen to walls before they start answering back. I'm grateful you kept the light with us tonight. Take it with you when you go. And if a letter ever shifts while you're watching, don't look away too soon. This has been Somnolent Conspiracies, where silence always has a witness, and truth finds its shape in the dark. Stay awake, stay curious, and remember, every shadow has a story, and we'll be here to tell it.